Hello and welcome to Practical 365 Live. We are live for the first time, honestly, and I'm here with Michael van Horenbeeck. I shouldn't be laughing though because it's a serious subject today. So Michael van Horenbeeck, you're also known as Michael van Hybrid because of your long tenure talking about Exchange Hybrid at various conferences over the years. And you're also Microsoft Certified Solutions Master as well, aren't you?
One of the last ones, right? I was in the last rotation for Exchange 2013.
Yeah.
Seems like ages ago. I think it was 2016 or so. No, actually 2014. So it's a long time ago, but still carried the legacy and still carried the quote unquote title.
Yeah.
But still very valuable to up until today. And as I said earlier in the muted version of this, Exchange is my first love and it'll be
Yeah.
my last. So even though I'm not really doing a lot of Exchange these days,
Yeah.
still very fond of it and very monitoring it closely,
Yeah.
literally and figuratively speaking, that is.
Yeah, and I'm still doing a fair bit of Exchange, but one thing that you're doing a fair bit more than I am is working with various scene products, working on the security side. And for those that don't know, you publish a book that's regularly updated, a bit like Office 365 IT Pros, don't you?
Yeah, so it's the Microsoft 365 Security for IT Pros. And we're about to release our newest version, the 2022 edition, on August 16.
Yeah.
And apologies for the background noise, but that's what happens when you go live. So yeah, and that book covers everything, Microsoft 365 Security and Azure Sentinel because it's a better together story.
Yeah.
So what we've done is we've taken the model that Tony developed over the years, whereby someone can purchase a subscription, if you will, for a year to the book, and we do monthly updates because it's a cloud service. It evolves at light speed, so we keep up to date so that other people don't have to. They just have the book and reference the book, and they get the knowledge pushed to them, at least what we think is really relevant and important.
Yeah. And the thing that we wanted to talk about primarily is really where I think you come in handy, where we've got this intersection of continuous hammering of Exchange and of course the security issues as well. So one thing that was sort of breaking news really as we were going into Friday evening in the UK and had been not necessarily a big issue over the last few days, but certainly started to come to my attention really past the point that we'd done Friday's podcast was that there's been some talks over the last few days at Blackhat 2021 and in particular going into some of the detail on the Exchange exploits that wreaked havoc on any Exchange admin, hybrid or on-premises life. It's really since through March, April, May, June, July, and unfortunately now August on a sort of semi-regular basis. And the first of these is potentially how that happened. And the second of this is something that really we need to be watching out for over the coming days. And then we were going to talk more about, well, what do you do then? This is not going to be something that just disappears. They hammer one down and then give it a couple of months and we'll be back to just publish Exchange to the internet. Who cares? They've had a security issue, has it? That's not coming back, and it's going to remain a target. I think this conference has sort of said, have a go. Look, see what you can find in it. So first of all, one of these things that came out of this talk at Blackhat 2021 by this person go by the name of Orange is proxy logon, and this is the person that found these issues and reported them to Microsoft. And for those that haven't seen any of this, what is proxy logon the term for?
Yeah, so proxy logon basically is the vulnerability that was used in the earlier attacks earlier this year, March through May, I'd say, also dubbed Hafnium, whereby there was a vulnerability in Exchange which allowed unauthenticated access to the Exchange servers and allowed people to actually from there pivot into the network and wreak all sorts of havoc, right? Not just have access to data on the Exchange servers, but they had foothold in the environment, and from there could actually reach other targets. Without going into too much detail, it basically meant that you through that vulnerability you could easily, or quite easily, I would say, run a remote shell or reverse shell on the Exchange servers, which is quite dangerous because that gives interactive access to the environment. And what was, I'm not going to say mind-boggling, but what was interesting about that attack is the surprising ease with which that was possible, plus the fact that it was a 0-day, which means that the exploit itself was released onto the internet along with proof of concept code and the notion that, hey, this is already being exploited out in the wild, and there wasn't a patch available, right? And that's what a lot of people get worried about these days, is that it seems that there's more and more of these 0-day attacks happening, specifically maybe around Exchange, but I do want to clear that up. I don't think it's necessarily just Exchange, right? There is a increased focus by the security community, both red team, blue team, on these 0-day attacks, because as security postures of organizations get better and better, it becomes harder and harder to actually get into the environment, right?
Yeah.
We find out that we find ourselves that when we're doing, I'm not going to call it even pen testing, but when we're preparing the testing of our environment, comparing a regular Windows 10 device versus one that's running Defender for Endpoint, it's just infinitively more difficult to breach into a device that is well protected. It's not impossible, but it just makes it much harder. So if you have a 0-day in your back pocket, that may be the key to bypass detection, to bypass protection protocols, and just get into that environment. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, exploiting or finding 0-day vulnerabilities isn't easy, right? There's a lot of knowledge that goes into that, a lot of expertise. So it's a cat and mouse game where someone may find a 0-day, exploit it, and then it's just a matter of time that either it gets detected, it gets patched, and you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to over dramatize stuff, but it's, Microsoft just didn't get a break this year. There's a couple of them, one after the other. It creates the perception that, it's horrible software. I don't think it is. I think it just gets a lot of attention, and therefore, more things things are detected. And that's not necessarily the case with other software that just hardly gets any attention. Yeah. I mean, take a look at Kaseya, right? A remote access tool solution used by lots of MSSPs that was breached recently. I mean, it just shows you that it happens all the time. It happens everywhere. It's just a matter of time and finding them.
Yeah, and I think probably before this latest stuff came around on the podcast, Paul and I said something very similar. It's horrible to hear about a vendor. I think it was SolarWinds, the one that we were talking about, get attacked, and Microsoft were very. They didn't make a thing of it. Probably at that point they knew that going by the timeline of when these were reported to Microsoft, that they had some problems coming themselves. But we said this could happen to anybody, any vendor.
I mean, take a look at how long it took the best security teams in the world to detect that they were breached.
Yeah.
Like, it took them months before they figured out, wow, something's happening. So this is a game with very high stakes where you have very high skills working against one another. And it just isn't as simple as, oh, you should have blocked this, right? It's easy, to say that as an afterthought, but in the heat of the moment, I'm pretty sure that the little nuances that that things that may hint that someone's in your environment or actively exploiting, it just isn't easy. The only thing that I wonder is, following the SolarWinds attack, Microsoft at some point said, parts of our code was potentially taken away.
Yeah.
Now, following that disclosure, a couple of months later, we start seeing these 0-day vulnerabilities come out for exactly one of the applications for which code was leaked or supposedly leaked. So you wonder, are the same actors the ones that are now finding the 0-day vulnerabilities because they have access to the code and can more easily, work to find those 0-day vulnerabilities, or as it is with a lot of those vulnerabilities, are they just found by chance, or are those the ones you're just, continuously investing in the same things over and over in order to try things? It's you can wonder, and it's just interesting to see what they find. And what I'm actually happy about is that they are found, because if something like this is found, it breaks news. It
Yeah.
gets patched, which means that there's no more chance to exploit it anymore.
Yeah. And that is the key thing. So every time that this has came up, that's been my exact thought. It's good that these things are being found, because if they were being found but not reported to Microsoft and they were just being sold, then potentially that's what's been happening for a long time, and people just haven't been looking for it. And it's only recently that people seem to have really regularly been interested in things like Defender for Identity. So I remember a colleague of mine a few years ago, Tristan, and when ATA came out, was on its way out, he spent a significant amount of time getting us ready, expecting not a tidal wave, but expecting it to be quite popular. And then Defender, what was it? What was the version? Azure ATP was what it was, its cloud-based version that's became Defender for Identity. So used to saying Defender for Identity because no one really asked us and really wanted to talk about Azure ATP. That was Defender for Endpoint, or Defender ATP was very popular. People really sort of understood that there was there was money to save in a way by when they buy E5 buying this thing. But Defender for Identity, it seems to have got a lot more traction recently. But it's the simple stuff that people aren't even looking for. So forget 0 days. It's actors that are getting into your network. And I was chatting to somebody, I can't say who because they don't make obvious who they are, relative of mine though, and he works in IT as well, and he was saying that they reported all this responsibly to the ICO. Apparently not many do, but somebody used a pass the hash attack to gain privilege escalation in the environment. And I said that's literally like the demo example that Microsoft often use for Defender for Identity as to how. And this happens a lot. I've been involved not on the security side but on the cleanup side when something's been stopped in its tracks, and then there's some work to do to finish getting stuff in quite quickly or clean up after that there's been a bit of a mess. But it's ultimately things are going to go very, very badly wrong if you don't actually identify this in the first place. If you don't see it or see the first signs of sniffing around. And my example of what I was doing was in response to us seeing somebody sniffing around, informing the customer, and then there was things that they were planning to do. They, as most customers say, they understand big weakness areas like the desktop is one in particular, the unfinished Exchange migration another. These are things on their list to do, and they just hadn't been able to do them yet. And then this happened, so it was right, shore all this up and then do things properly on top. But my relative, they didn't see it. They were all out at a party when it happened, apparently, and came back and found everything had been damaged.
So that's the thing, right? We're talking about Defender for Endpoint and Defender for Identity, but it goes deeper, much deeper than that, right?
Yeah.
It goes into the very basics of security, the very, very basic stuff. One of the things that I was baffled with during the Hafnium attacks is for about a week, I'm not going to say 24/7, but it was close to 24/7. We were taking calls of people that needed help, figuring out whether or not they were hacked or attacked or otherwise compromised. And more often than not, we were, facing customers that didn't have any logging at all.
Yeah.
Or, they had the default 20 meg setting on their security event log in Windows, which meant a couple of hours worth of events and that's it.
Yeah.
We literally had to tell people there is no amount of information that you have available that is useful to us. Everything's gone. There's nothing that we can get from their environments. So basically, we were chasing ghosts and trying to figure out, where is something that we can use. They weren't keeping firewall logs. They weren't keeping server logs. They didn't even have proper endpoint detection and response for their servers or workstations. There's plenty of folks out there.
These tools are expensive, though. Splunk,
No,
Azure
they're not.
Sentinel, comparatively, until it's one of these things, isn't it, where you've been, if you've worked on the customer side at some point, or you've worked closely with customers, obviously, and often until something's went wrong, then you don't get budget to do something, and as much as you might have had your vendors in, and then you've seen the prices, and then you've made the case for it, that it maybe would rather spend that money on business change and adoption or something like that. It could be one of those things where until the monetary value has been seen and it's accepted that this either has happened to you or it will happen to you, then it's difficult to get even the money just to store the logs, let alone get the software to do them, unless you want to build them yourself. And seriously, no one's going to build a syslog NG server these days, again, are they? You need a proper solution.
It's not just that you need a proper solution, right? It's just getting to the basics. I mean, don't set up a SIEM if you have no idea on how to operate it or what to do with the data. I mean, by all means, stay away from it, right? But ensure that you have proper
Buy
protection.
a service.
Anyone who's familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, there's a couple of phases, right? Identify, protect, detect, respond, and then recover. Like, do the protect, detect, respond. Protect as much as you can.
Yeah.
Then, if you're done protecting whatever you can, you've spent all your knowledge and money on that, move into the detection phase so that you can detect what you can protect for. And then, obviously from detection comes the ability to respond to threats. And that's just a fact, right? I mean, let's just take the example of last Friday. To my knowledge today, there's 2 vulnerabilities out in the wild for Exchange, or at least there's talk of two vulnerabilities. There's one that was discussed at Blackhat, where someone could exploit AutoDiscover to exfiltrate data from an Exchange server.
Yeah.
And there is also another one that leverages another vulnerability in Exchange, or a potential vulnerability called Proxy Oracle, where again they can gain access to the Exchange server by doing something that is very similar to the proxy logon vulnerability that was used earlier this year.
Yeah.
And in the latter case, some people have tweeted in this InfoSec community, they've said, well, we've seen this attack on our environment, and others have confirmed that it's almost always the same set of IP addresses.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a solution for the problem. Like, we can't patch Exchange because there isn't a patch for it yet, right?
Yeah.
As the security community is trying to figure out what's happening, how to patch and so forth and so on, at least you should be able to detect whether you have incoming connections from such an IP address. And if you do, block them, right? Or if you lack that capability, maybe you should take the decision to temporarily block your Exchange server from the internet if you're still running one.
Yeah.
What surprises me is that lots of organizations don't even have that. They're unaware. They don't have the capability to detect or monitor. They're just, they're not taking good care of their environment. They're just, leaving it up to whatever it is doing.
I mean, what this is always the challenge though with the security community, where you're bridging the gap in a way where it's easy to criticize system administrators for not doing things right. And earlier in the year, I think you were on a live session with, was it Paul and Jeff? Yeah, and I think Paul probably made the same point that he may have made in the podcast. I can't remember whether he made it in both, which is there's effectively almost a whole generation of new IT sysadmins who are not Exchange experts anymore. They're not aware of the reasons for patching it. It's Oracle, not mentioned for different reasons, but as in an Exchange admin having to look after an Oracle server and not knowing the difference between 9, 10, 11 and the different patch levels and why, or how to patch it, or what happens if you patch it, what will you break, and maybe even thinking, well, should I just do is there an in-place upgrade? Should I be on the latest version? All sorts of things that if you're not experienced administrating it, then it's really difficult because you've been told to do this as part of your job. And a lot of folks, I expect the majority of folks who are are running servers that are vulnerable are the same folks who are also looking after 10 other different systems or more. They might be partway through a project to do X, Y, and Z. They might be dealing with internal applications, line of business applications, custom applications. And Exchange is just one of those sort of things where they've been told it's a commodity service and they haven't really focused their skills because nobody's going to try and be the next Michael van Horenbeeck for Exchange, are they, to be fair? Because there's just not the need to learn that about Exchange or Exchange hybrid these days. So it's understandable in a way why, although it's quite frustrating for security folks to say, just take it off the internet or just patch it, it's a business critical system, in many cases. And yes, if it's a business critical system, yeah, you should know how to administer it, but it's difficult, for people to just do it.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And this isn't about the system administrator that is trying to do their best, right? They're trying, but they're not getting the tools. They're not getting the budgets. They're not getting what they need in order to do their job properly. Hell, a lot of them are working too many hours. They're constantly being bombarded with questions from everyone about everything. And, I think we can all safely say there is no way that any one guy can know everything. You can be specialized in a little thing, or you can be a jack of all trades.
Yeah.
But just reality is, it is hard. So this is in no way a critique to any of those folks. But at the end of the day, it is a critique to how people run their businesses. When you run a business, regardless of what you do business-wise, you have a certain responsibility to the people that work in your organization. And if you have an infrastructure, it's your responsibility to make sure that that infrastructure is safe, especially if you're dealing with third-party data, like personal data of other people. And then the mismanagement of the environment. And I don't mean the bad will, because it's always based on goodwill, but the lack of knowledge on how to properly maintain those systems, on how to properly protect, detect, and respond. That's on the business, right? And it's kind of like a car. If you don't know how to maintain a car, you bring it to the garage and you actually get it maintained for you, and that costs money too. It's a commodity, and people should start treating not just Exchange but their environment as such as well. They should go back to the basics and make sure that they cover the basics. And until we do that, we're going to have plenty more of these zero-day vulnerabilities that are going to have a huge impact, because a 0 day, there's nothing you can do about it, right? You can't even patch proactively. You're out there in the wild with everyone else trying to fight it off. But if you have no other defense mechanism, no detection capabilities, no anything else, well, you're in a much worse shape than anyone who has even the most basic filtering and detection capabilities there. And I'm not saying that all those system administrators should be monitoring every tweet and feed and whatever, but there are subscription services that provide intelligence like this and push it out to you with notifications and even tell you, this is important, take a look at this, and take away a bit of that burden. Sure, there is a cost associated with it, but it's something you really should do.
Well, yes. And this is, I guess, partly the reason why we went live today, right? Because if you subscribe to the site or you look at our YouTube channel, you might not necessarily be following half the people in the security community. And to be honest, like a lot of these online communities, there's a lot of noise, a lot of arguments about this, that, and the other. So it's hard to sort of see the important thing in there, especially when you'll see tweets like, "Why is anyone running Exchange anymore?" I think back when the Hafnium stuff came around, there was even somebody, I'll leave his name because he's such a great person, leave his name out of it, but tweeting out that, why are you running Exchange? Are you kidding? You work at Microsoft. There's a reason why we're having to still run Exchange, even though we've moved to the cloud. But that aside, you can look at the security community and it can actually be quite frustrating if you're following those folks on Twitter, because you don't want to get involved in their arguments, but there's a lot of noise around their view, but they're not necessarily the people doing it. People like Swift on Security, who's came from a support background, is probably one of the people who is pretty good, because that's somebody who might have started out as a joke account, but does make it pretty clear that this you can't just do these things. It is difficult. There's people in the cybersecurity industry do underestimate all of the things that you've just mentioned. So part of the reason for doing this today is to sort of shine a bit of a spotlight on that, and the thing that you need to know about, which is that right now, if you've got even just auto discover exposed to the internet, which you might have, then if you're not monitoring those logs to see what requests are hitting the servers on IIS and so on, then you might actually have somebody sniffing around trying to look to add you to a list of potential targets for when there is something bad. And if they are sniffing around, if they are adding you to the list, then they'll be back, and you will hopefully have patched by then. There'll be a patch maybe, and you will have applied it, but it's very unlikely. So you've got to think about, one, are you vulnerable? Are you going to be SYN? Probably yes. These folks have been doing a really good job over the weekend. This chap, Gossy the dog is his handle on Twitter. He has been running a honeypot exchange server. He's seen a lot of these requests hitting his. Folks in the security community are actively sharing what to look for. But if that bit's missing, then, and you're not reading this because you're just looking after Exchange or whatever, and you'll read this site for advice, and your takeaway from Friday's podcast was I should do more Exchange scripting, then your Monday morning task is not learn about Ingo's tips and tricks on how to write better graph scripts or installing the Exchange Online PowerShell module version 2. It's to start looking and seeing what you should be doing here, because you've got a good explainer from these folks as to what they found, what their targets are. They're looking at the client access service. That's the thing that they want to. That's where they're finding all these vulnerabilities. And then you've got people actively scanning for a proof of concept vulnerability that is going to give. There's two ones. Is it credential escalation? Proxy Oracle is not necessarily the same as the proxy logon, where you could get a shell, but being able to retrieve passwords and then get. Okay,
no,
so
that's why I said there's two ways. Right?
They can act as system on the server, yeah. So the proof of concept showed, I think, but I may be getting some of these mixed up. But you can run commands as system, and system on Exchange has a lot of rights on the network because the computer account is added to the Exchange service, which basically it's doing everything that you could do via remote PowerShell with Exchange org admin rights, basically. So nasty. So you need to be looking for these things. But what if you've got 3 Exchange servers? You start looking through the logs, and you're scanning through them, and you're just seeing all the normal stuff. I'll pop something on the blog for Monday morning, but there's particular things to look for. But what would you, if you didn't have a scene, what would you be looking for then, or what would you be using to search the logs, other than Notepad?
Yeah, Notepad ++. No, honestly. So I just want to quickly, first talk a little bit about something you said here, right?
Yeah.
You kind of hit the nail on the head when you spoke about all the things that you could and should be doing. That's the challenge, right? People don't know or understand anymore how Exchange really works, aside from some of the people like Ingo and Paul and yourself that have the ins and the outs of an Exchange server. People don't know what it does, how it works, where its vulnerabilities may lie. And that's the other part, right? That's on the InfoSec community. That's on Microsoft. We're making it way too hard for people to understand the impact of certain things. Like over the past 2 days, there have been blogs and tweets about how bad this is. Now, try and convey that message to a system administrator is responsible for that sole Exchange server that's still sitting on premises.
Yeah.
They have no clue what you're talking about, like proxy logon, proxy Oracle, auto-discover v1, v2. They're like, I don't care. Just tell me what I need to do to solve this problem.
Yeah.
And it's because we didn't make it clear enough on what actually needs to happen that people keep falling, into the same trap over and over again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, right, during my troubleshooting for Hafnium back then, what I noticed is that a couple of basic things were missing, right? Some
Okay.
organizations didn't have proper antivirus, or they had an antivirus, but the legacy version thereof, right? No EDR kind of solution that was behavior monitoring. I mean, I don't care if it's Defender for Endpoint or you're using CrowdStrike or SentinelOne, but just use something that is modern and decent for one,
Yeah.
right? They those solutions won't stop you from, or won't stop an attacker from exploiting a zero-day vulnerability, but they might catch the activities that follow the exploitation of such a vulnerability, and at least something's happening.
Yeah.
It's the same with the proxy oracle or the vulnerability that we're dealing with here right now. Is as soon as a reverse shell is established in Exchange, and someone starts moving laterally in the environment or starts executing certain PowerShell commandlets as the system account in Exchange, which you mentioned is really bad,
Yeah.
you should have some form of logging. And let's just assume you don't have an EDR. Let's just assume you don't have a SIM. At the very least, make sure that you keep more than a couple of hours worth in your security logs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the days where we needed to cap our logs at 100 megs are long gone. Like, I see servers with a terabyte worth of storage on their operating system drive, and there's plenty of room left to store more security logs. So at least increase it to a gig, 2 gigs, so that you have a certain history of the security logs. And then secondly, like script logging, PowerShell script logging, because one of the things that happens is when someone exploits a vulnerability like this, they're inevitably going to run other scripts and other tools in order to do things in the environment. Well, if you don't know, or if you have no visibility into what they did, then you don't know, right? And that's the challenge. But by having those security logs up to the maximum, and by having script block logging for PowerShell, for instance, at the very least, you might be able to detect certain things after the fact. And once you have detected that they did something, there's two benefits. First of all, you know for sure that you've been breached, and you can shut down the systems, turn off internet access, whatever. And secondly, you can try and figure out what they did, because if they did expose data, then first of all, you've got some legal stuff to deal with. And secondly, it's a great learning opportunity on how to prevent this from happening again in the future.
Yeah. And that there's one key point in there. You need to understand what they've done. Because if you don't understand what they've done, then you don't know whether they're still in there. You don't know where they've went and hidden themselves away. And that's that. So logs, looking for the right things in logs and preempting this. And I think then there's another side to this where I know that I've said a few people that I know in person on Twitter. I've met them in real life. They come to user groups and so on. They've bit in response to some other replies to some of the cybersecurity community where I've seen some replies and somebody said, again, clearly not an Exchange admin of any sort at all in any way. Otherwise, they wouldn't have replied and said, I don't know why anybody's publishing Exchange to the internet. What's wrong with these people? And somebody replied back and explained why. And I didn't look anymore because, that's one of those things where the person who said it will probably stick to their guns about it, and it's going to go nowhere. However, let's talk about publishing Exchange. Start with the most common these days, I suppose, scenario, which is where you've moved to the cloud, or you're moving to the cloud, one of the two, and you've still got Exchange published. You probably shouldn't, right? If you finished your migration, it shouldn't be published to the outside world. I would be worried, and I know that there are people who've left things the way they are. I'd be worried if I knew that an organisation had finished their Exchange migration and they knew that someone had told them quite rightly that they've got to keep an Exchange server for management of Exchange attributes in AD while they've got Azure AD Connect. There's no argument about that. That's fact. But that perhaps they've thought, well, I'll leave the hybrid server up and running. I'll keep renewing the SSL certificates. It's, last time I read about this, Microsoft had said that that's fine, because they did say that was fine. You don't need pre-authentication. Maybe you'll have a load balancer, just push it straight through. All is good. We do that in Exchange Online. So if maybe they've left it like that and occasionally been patching it or kept current with patches, then they're vulnerable right now. And they should have actually changed the service connection point to null or to autodiscover.outlook.com/autodiscover/autodiscover.xml or what have you, to redirect autodiscover requests to the right place. Yeah, they shouldn't be telling AD clients to hit those Exchange servers, and they don't need to publish them to the outside world. The DNS entries can be updated to point it outside, and that's what people should be doing right now. They shouldn't be publishing Exchange if they've migrated to the cloud. Those endpoints just shouldn't be there. And one of the most common ones that you may consider leaving, or maybe you started in a position where you're about to do your migration and you've set up coexistence with Exchange 2016, 2013, 2019, wrong order, sorry, and you've got Teams calendaring working, right? And perhaps you're moving a few mailboxes across, so you've got Autodiscover, you've got EWS, but you've probably got Autodiscover published to everybody, so that an Outlook client can go through the motions and what have you. But you also wanted Autodiscover published so that all the right bits are going to work to Exchange Online. And perhaps for your migration, you've got MRS proxy endpoints as well, published via HTTPS. Now, fundamentally, you probably want to reconsider the scope of those. So if they're not scoped to just the service IP addresses, so for example, the Teams connection isn't just Exchange Online. So you might do it and go, it didn't work. You've got to do it to the Teams IP addresses as well. So revisit those firewall rules so you're actually only publishing what you need. And there's another common sort of trope in here with your first Exchange migrations, where what you could do, especially if you had older Outlook clients, so Outlook 2013, Outlook 2010. Do you remember what you'd need to do to get an external client that hadn't VPN'd in to get into Exchange Online the right way without mucking up your Autodiscover externally for on-prem?
There's a couple of ways that you could do that, right?
One would be publish Autodiscover from your on-prem environment, so you had the double hop. Modern Outlook, so Office, Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise. The Outlook version in there, I think Outlook 2016 as well, I'd have to double check. When they detect a mailbox in the service, then the first thing they'll do before Autodiscover is connect the account. So although prior to these issues, with or without pre-auth, I would have thought it would be a reasonable thing to do to publish Autodiscover externally. So as you moved away from your VPN type model to get in, clients who, once they're moved over, wouldn't need the VPN in anymore, because this would really just be a trigger point to throw them to the right place in the cloud, and then all your new zero trust model will be in place. That's a hole for you now. That's a danger. So rethinking even things like that. And then as soon as you're finished, locking it down. Lock down the IP address ranges now. Reconsider publishing just Autodiscover. And then we've got the final one, which is you're running Exchange on premises today. You followed all the rules. You followed all the guidance from Microsoft. People like us as well, to be frank. Sure. We've said this in the past. I don't know whether you have, to be fair. I have. And I agreed with it. I wasn't particularly keen on pre-authentication for Exchange, especially with the hybrid stuff, it causing a lot of problems, causing a lot of issues, trying to publish things as directly as possible, trying to cut out things that weren't needed. There's no real justifiable reason to recommend not using pre-authentication anymore for a standard Exchange system that's published. Really, I think we are all the days of ISA and pre-authentication, F5 load balancers, pre-authentication for external clients. That's you've got to really pre-authenticate every single request to the environment. Exchange doesn't have a fantastic track record, and anymore. This has probably been true for at least a year.
Maybe not anymore, right? But I mean, I don't think that pre-auth is going to be the pinnacle that solves everything, right?
No. exactly. Because if you had an attack that required an account, then yeah, if you haven't got multi-factor authentication as well for on premises, which you can do, even with even stuff like Kemp load balancers, F5 that uses your SSO. Even if you haven't got, if you were just using pre-auth on its own, it's not going to solve your problems, but it's going to solve no account attacks. It's it's a starting point. You need MFA, obviously, right?
So I agree to some extent, right? It will solve some challenges, and maybe the ones that we're seeing right now. But at the end of the day, it is a play of multiple pieces. It is making sure that you publish securely. I mean, we've had talks 10 times to Sunday, but how do you actually publish an Exchange server to the internet? You don't put it directly onto the internet, like port forwarding 443, that IP address into the Exchange. But how many orgs have done that? Too many. Way too many.
I mean, only really, single server organizations would have even considered it. And I haven't came across one who's done that recently. I think most people have been, there's exceptions to the rule, and you may have seen worse than me. But what I would generally see is that people will, even if it is the box ticking exercise, be putting a load balancer or reverse proxy in the way, but not necessarily a web application firewall. The primary purpose of it is load balancing. So to put a foot into the DMZ to then bring the requests in.
And that is the challenge, Steve. It's not just great that you have a load balancer and a firewall, but at least you need a reverse proxy. No, sorry. Let's talk web application firewall. Yeah. Will they stop all attacks? No, but it gives you more capabilities to respond to threats like these, right? And it does stop certain things like cross-site scripting and stuff.
Yeah.
These devices, these appliances or software, regardless of how you implement it, are capable of detecting these types of attacks that follow exploitation of a vulnerability often. So, I mean, by having something like that in between, you immediately increase the security posture of your environment and decrease the risks associated with even a zero-day vulnerability. So there's a lot of little things that you can do in order to just become better at protecting your environment. You can't stop anyone from gaining access. That's why we have the assume breach mindset, or should have the assume breach mindset. But at the end of the day, it's, if you're not doing any of these things, you're just failing, yourself, the organization, and the server for that matter too. And maybe the example of the proxy oracle vulnerability that we're facing now is a bad one, because that's one that's just really hard to keep out because sometimes things are just really, really bad. And there is something to be said about these organizations that fall prey to these types of attacks. I'm not talking about the large organizations that are in an indefinite hybrid state because they've got mailboxes on-prem and in the cloud and God knows what. I'm talking about all these organizations that have one or two Exchange servers with a couple of hundreds, maybe, mailboxes running on them. Why on earth are they still doing that?
I know why. I can tell you exactly why.
Sorry?
I can tell you exactly why. It's all about, it's the fallacy of feeling like you've done a good job if you've ran everything on a shoestring. You bought a SAM once and you want to get every penny out of it you can. You work for an organisation that doesn't value IT, low margin industries, seen as a cost centre. The only way that you can prove value to your bosses is by running everything into the ground for as long as possible and proving that you can make this darn thing work, even if it kills you or puts your data at risk.
If that's the goal, then just accept the fact that you're vulnerable and that you're going to get breached one way or another, not just Exchange but anything else, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if that's how you look at things, then sorry, there's no salvation to be found. I think the organizations that are willing to do something about it, ask yourself this: do you want to take the risk of running Exchange. Not because Exchange is bad software, don't get me wrong. It's because you may not have the resources and the skills to properly run such a service in your own environment. That's what it is about. And we can substitute Exchange for any other application for that matter, right?
But there's not many applications. I take Skype. Take Skype for Business, right? Say you were running Skype for Business server, and you'd migrated to Teams fully. You wouldn't be running a Skype for Business server on premises. Microsoft do want you to run an Exchange server on premises, at least one. At the end of a migration, we've talked through this so many times. You've stood on stage and said it. Years ago, when you were still doing Exchange, people were asking you, when will Microsoft solve this? Every hybrid implementation you've done, people still were asking you that question at the time, all over for the last 10 years.
But that's fine, Steve.
It's fine. But it's like, well, that Microsoft do have a little bit of they've got to work quick. They've got to work quick. We understand it's a complex problem. A tactical solution would have made more mess than it would have been worth it. You'd end up with messy Active Directories if they'd have done the most obvious thing, just cut the attribute set. So I can understand why, and people still need mail relay. So, there's reasons. I'm not getting at Microsoft. I'm not getting at the system admins either, because it's been a difficult position, but it's been seen as a stable product. So there's, I hear you, but I'm
not talking about the lost Exchange server conundrum, right? For those people that have migrated to the cloud and that are keeping that Exchange server, yes, it's bad. But why are you publishing it? Like, just take it out, just put it internally, turn it off, and just turn it on when you need it, for all I care. Just make sure that you patch it and that you monitor it and that you have an antivirus.
That's very true.
Running on it. That's fine.
More than not published to the outside world. Even if it's on the internal network, it's still potentially vulnerable, because if somebody's got an account for your VPN off the black market, which is how they got into my relative's organization, and he was telling me about this the other night. That's how they got in, right? Nothing was published at all, apparently. Then, if they can see your Exchange servers from somewhere, so not only that, does that load balancer or does that Exchange? We've always been told that there should be any rule for anything for the networks the Exchange servers talk to, and most people are not going to have went and restricted the VLAN to stop port 443 HTTPS from their normal clients hitting the Exchange servers. But it's a good question, isn't it, whether you should allow that as well if you're running that server. We're in interesting territory here.
Steve.
Hey,
you need a layered approach. Sure, I mean, you haven't published it to the internet, great, but now someone's in your network. Well, either segregate it, make sure there is an EDR running, make sure there's proper logging, that you know what's happening. I mean, again, assume breach. We're just going to assume that someone's in your network already. So do the right things, even if it's a single server. It's kind of like, the Azure AD Connect server. It's the same thing. People don't treat it with the respect it deserves, right? It is a critical part of your infrastructure, and it can be a massive pain in the royal behind to deal with, because it deals with your identities. Someone messing with your Azure AD Connect server for synchronization, that's a really, 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 really bad thing.
It's your last line of defense in a way. Oh my God.
So at the end of the day,
it's possible if you lost control of your AD but still had control of Azure AD Connect server for that few minutes, then you'd have salvation. You'd have salvation, So yeah, absolutely. It's excellent point about that. But there's assume breach. There's mitigating things that you can do in the short term. Implementing new EDR product is not a let's do it from Monday. It's think about this. This is the time to really begin to make the case if you haven't. I'm not selling anything. I don't care what product you use. Neither do you. Really, you need to, as you say, lay it down. What's the quickest thing that you can do that's going to be risk free? Start doing these things, and you've got two of those, which is limit where you're publishing these services to, especially if it's just your last Exchange server, and analyze your logs by the right means to look for the right things. Yes, you need a proper product, but in the shortest term, then do something. Something is
Two
better than
things
nothing.
from monitoring perspective that I want every Exchange admin out there doing. Increase, I've said it 3 times, I'm going to say it one more time, increase the log file size for the security log on your Exchange server. Make sure that you're properly logging all the security events and that you're keeping them. And that, by some means, if someone has cleared the security log. 1. 2, enable script block logging for PowerShell. Yes, it will generate a lot of logs. Yes, you may see potentially sensitive information for scripts that are being run and that contain passwords and all of that, but it is invaluable in terms of forensics if you want to see if a PowerShell script was run and what was run through a PowerShell script. Will it help you in any case? No, it will help you in a lot of cases. But if you don't have any time or any money to spend, these are the things that you can do because they're free to do, right?
Yeah.
You can do them right away. And then plan ahead for all the other layers of defense that you may have missed. But those are 2 easy things. And they won't prevent exploitation. Don't get me wrong. They won't help you against the attack, but at least you'll be able to detect or see what they did and not fly entirely blind. And that's just 2 of the grievances I had from coming out of Hafnium. And I'm pretty sure that most of the organizations I talked to, and I gave them that advice, I want to see whether or not they actually did this.
Well, the time will tell, I suppose. But one thing that we're going to do, going to pop some of these recommendations up as well, because I like the way you're thinking a lot. A lot of the same suggestions as well, but in particular, I think the one that I wouldn't have put first and foremost because it almost seems too obvious, which is increase the size of your logs, because I've not seen that clearly as much because I'm not on the same security side as you, but that's absolutely critical. And then monitoring those logs, plan for the future. You've got an immediate thing to look for now, immediate tasks to do. You need to do some mitigation in the shorter term if you haven't already. But from having a look at one of these websites that the security folks are touting around at the moment, then there's an online map, and I'll put a link to this in the blog post as well, that's showing loads of servers. I think Germany was the hotspot. So Deutschland is the hotspot. Siggy and Ingo will be pleased to hear. Siggy probably the most of all. Dominic Hofling is a cloud security architect and an former Exchange MVP. So he's going to be very busy. So maybe we'll get him on the podcast as well to see whether he's had a nightmare in a few weeks' time. But this is a problem. This is not something to ignore. You probably don't know you're in this position. So take heed of that. Look for your mitigating strategy. Look at your plan above that. It's not, all right, we'll just block this off, move on to the next thing. You need, as Michael points out, this isn't just Exchange. These are other things. If Exchange is the thing now, then other things will be next. So plan that strategy now. You've got an excellent opportunity where you've got a vulnerable system and say, look, we really need to invest in this area. We've not got the right tools to support us. We need to make sure that we've got EDR tooling. We need to make sure that we either have a service or an outsourced provider, or we employ. Don't just buy a SIEM and throw it in and deal with it, as Michael says. It's a particular set of skills that you need. Or am I confusing you with Liam Neeson? You've got to take this seriously in the long term. This is sort of an ongoing thing, because if you find a problem, that means you've not been taking it seriously enough. And if you're building Exchange out or you're doing hybrid for somebody today, then you need to be aware of these issues. If you're saying publish Exchange to the internet, we're going to migrate to the cloud, or fast track worse, telling you, I'm sure they won't, to just do X, Y, and Z, think very carefully as well. And I think that's we've got to wrap it up. I think, is there anything else you wanted to add to that as we run into the final 30 field?
I'm going to do a Steve Jobs thing. One more thing. The patching that we talked about, keep up to date. Like, there was an update for Exchange CD released mid-July, right?
Yeah.
Which actually patches or mitigates part of the proxy Oracle issues that we had.
Yeah.
Again, how many orgs have already deployed this? Not many, right? Too little is the answer. Probably a lot of them, but not all of them. Not too little. Try to stay current. That is probably the most effective way to stay protected. Again, it won't help against 0 days, but it's so critically important. Now we can talk an entire hour about how to stay up to date with Exchange, because it can be a little bit of a mess, especially if you haven't kept up to date for a long time, right? But at the end of the day, it is your responsibility to maintain those updates on a regular cadence, have a process, go through the motions every time again. Yes, it is a churn, because it's every month, every patch Tuesday, you're like, oh God, again. But it's just the process that you have to go through.
Yeah, and one thing that's been patching is our last thing. One thing that you probably wore, were you one of these people that wore one of these t-shirts that something about Exchange 2013 is great except for this particular CU.
Exchange 2013 isn't ready until Service Pack 1 and KB, whatever it was.
That's it.
I remember vividly. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I remember you saying you were the person that broke Exchange in your organisation you're working at the time, because you're on the tap for Exchange 2013. So, reliability of Exchange patches, the latest CUs for 2016 or 2019, maybe both or one of them. There were known problems with them, it happens. So, you still need to test them. Security updates are a different matter, though. A security update is something you need to apply very, very quickly. It's not let's wait until everybody else has seen the issues. Keep up to date.
Especially security updates. Like if you see these highly critical ones where they have a very high score, a CV score, there's no reason why not to do that, right? It's just like, go ahead and deploy them. Sure, if you can test them, great. But if you can't, I'd willingly take the risk at that point in time of deploying it onto one server and see what happens, and then deploy it on another one, rather than not doing it at all.
Absolutely.
Right? I ask for an emergency window to deploy it in the evening when news like this breaks out. But unfortunately, lots of people aren't even aware that this is happening, and those organizations are the ones that are, actually going to get hurt afterwards, because those are the ones that are going to get breached. Not because someone's after them, but there are website services out there that scan the internet for you and just give you a list of here's vulnerable servers. There you go. You don't even have to search for them anymore. You can just pick and choose, cherry pick them, and be like, oh, I'm going to try this one today. And with services like that and scale that we're operating at, you just can't take any chances.
Exactly. So thank you so much for joining me today, Michael. It's been a bit of a reminder from the old days of the UC Architects. Just in on the other week as well. Who's next? I think he'll probably be Michelle's or Roy maybe as well. We'll have to have him along to find out what he's up to as well. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been fantastic as always. So check out Practical 365. Put a quick write-up tonight about this for you to have a look. Probably get it published tomorrow, which is Monday. Thank you if you've watched the whole thing this evening. And if you're watching this today, check out the link under this. If you're watching this Monday, Tuesday, check out the link under this to that post. Thanks for watching.